the American culture. When you talk to most Americans, they don't really think of Americans as having a culture different from other people. They think other people have a culture, but that Americans themselves don't have a unique, distinct culture. Well, most scholars that look at culture will tell you that Americans have a very unique culture, and that the culture is composed of 13 values, and that these values taken together really do compose an extremely unique culture that is specific to America. There's a scholar by the name of L. Robert Coles. He's identified 13 values that he believes that Americans possess, and I'd like to tell you about those values today. The first value he talks about is the value of personal control over the environment. For the majority of the world right now, about 7/8 of the world believes in fate. They believe that fate controls their life and that they have very little control over themselves. Americans, by contrast, believe that we control our own destiny. And we also tend to look down on people who do believe in fate. We think of those cultures as being primitive or being somewhat backward. The United States considers it to be normal for us to control our environment. We do things like build dams, we build highways, we use vaccinations, we take vitamins. We control our lives in a variety of ways. So personal control over the environment is a very important value for us. The second value that Coles talks about is change. Although most people go kicking and screaming when change happens, Americans believe that change is very strongly linked to positive development. We have to have change. We don't keep things for a long time in America. We frequently tear down buildings. I mean, you often see in the newspaper this idea that people have to picket to get a historical place saved, whereas other cultures shun change and they tend to keep tradition. The third value is time and its control. Americans are very centered on time. We're what are called monochronic people. We have schedules. We stick to those schedules. We don't deviate from them. Things are supposed to start on time. If a plane is delayed for 15 minutes, we get a little antsy. We're very time driven, whereas other cultures are much more laid back. That you might have 10 clocks in a city and they might all read different times. Well, that would not be true in America. Our clocks are all set to the same time. In fact, they are often synchronized, and when they're not, we get a little concerned about that. The value of time is also reflected in our language. You have things like you have to be on time. Time has to be kept. It has to be filled. It's saved. It's used. It's spent. It's wasted. It can be lost, gained, planned, given, and we can even kill it. The fourth American value that Cole talks about is equality. For Americans, this is one of the most cherished values, and in fact, it's even in our Constitution. We believe that everybody in America has an equal opportunity to succeed. We believe that God views us all as being equal. In practice, our society may not show this equality, but in our constitutional beliefs, we believe that all people are created equal and that one person is not better than another. You're not born at a higher status. You're all born equal. In fact, it's to your advantage to be born poor, and then you, through this work ethic that we have, you can become successful. So it's harder for other cultures when they come to the United States that have an idea of birthright to come here, and they often feel treated very shabbily because we don't treat people differently based on their last name or who they are. Now, our Hollywood people we do treat like royalty, but for the most part, people are pretty much treated equally. The fifth value that Cole talks about is individualism, and by far Americans are the most individualistic people in the world. Individualism means that we view each person as being a very unique and wonderful entity, and that our society is basically structured around the individual. We have laws, we have social organizations that protect individual rights. We're very interested in how the individual relates to society. We're not collective. We don't work in groups well. We're interested in having my own car. We don't share things well. The other aspect about individualism, again, is reflected in our language. We have phrases such as, God helps those who help themselves. You pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. We have things like, do your own thing. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. You made your bed, now you lie in it. So language also reflects the emphasis that we have on the individual. Very closely related to individualism is our sense of privacy. Americans are extremely private individuals. We put fences around our houses. We don't share tables. If we go to a cafe, if someone comes and sits with us, we think that's very unusual. We tend to work alone on projects. We have private offices. We're not a very collective society. The sixth value that Cole talks about is this self-help concept, which is somewhat related to the other values that I talked about. We only take credit for what we do. We don't ascribe to this idea that, well, because my father was a famous person, then I'm a famous person. No, that doesn't work here. You have to earn your own recognition. And in fact, sometimes Americans find living in the shadow of a very famous person is a very difficult thing for an American to do. Americans pride themselves on having been born poor, working hard, sacrificing, pulling yourself up from your own bootstraps, and achieving their own wealth. The seventh value that we talk about is competition. Again, Americans are extremely competitive, which again is related to being an individual and related to self-help. Americans believe that competition brings out the best in an individual. We assert that it challenges or forces each person to produce the very best that is humanly possible. So again, competition is often emphasized in small children, in the school systems that we have, the way grading processes are done. We rank individuals. We have SAT scores. What score did you get? We're very competition driven. The eighth value is related to our relationship in time. And Americans, the three perspectives can be either past, present, or future. And Americans are very future-oriented. We value what's going to be happening next. We don't look to the back. We don't look to the past for instruction. There are many cultures that look to the elderly for the wisdom. They spend a lot of time studying the history. They talk about tradition. The past to them is extremely important. Americans tend not to hold on to the past so much. We often talk about putting that behind us and moving ahead. And we are certainly not present-driven. We don't live in the present time. We're always thinking about what's going to be happening tomorrow, or why am I doing this? I'm working hard today so I can retire tomorrow. The ninth value that Cole talks about is this action-work orientation. And I've already talked about a variety of ways that Americans are very driven by work. We often define ourselves by our professions. When you meet, one of the first questions that you ask a person is, what do you do? We don't spend a lot of time talking about their background or who they're married to, but what we really want to know is, how are you related to the social structure of work? The 10th value is that Americans, we really value an informal structure. Compared to other cultures, we approach our lives in a very informal way. We tend to call each other by our first names. We don't generally flaunt titles. We we generally dress in a very informal way. We don't, for example, dress for dinner. We have very informal greetings. Hi, how are you? Our speech is informal. The way we interact with people is very informal, compared with other cultures that have a very formal, rigid way of interacting. Americans are very laid back in that sense. The 11th value is that we value being direct, open, and honest. That's something that's really stressed even in children. Children, look at me when you talk. We suspect people are lying to us when they're not giving us direct eye contact. We feel it's very important to tell people straight away what it is we're thinking. In cultures where saving face is important, Americans are often perceived as being very rude or trying to hurt the feelings of another person. Other cultures may not directly say no. They may say no in a way by not showing up, or they'll maybe just nod and smile when an American would say, "How dare you say that?" and be very aggressive or confrontative in a situation. So directness, openness, and honesty are 3 characteristics that Americans feel are very important to possess. The 12th value is practicality. Americans are extremely practical. We see a problem and we set out to solve it. Americans have been known to be the greatest inventors. The American culture has produced more machines and more answers to problems than any other culture in the history of the world. We really value figuring out the best, cheapest, fastest way to do things, and we often have done that. Another way in which